Well, good afternoon, everyone. Hello, and welcome to this Cavell Group webinar with Akixi, Maximising Margins, Strategic Insights for Teams of Voice Providers. Today, we'll be exploring the world of Microsoft Teams telephony. My name is Patrick Watson, Head of Research at Cavell Group, and I'll be joined by an expert in this field, Chief Product and Marketing Officer at Akixi, Mike Wilkinson. How are you this afternoon, Mike?
Good, thanks, Patrick. Very happy to be here this afternoon and looking forward to the webinar.
Pleasure to have you with me today. Before we get into the session itself, I just wanted to take everyone through a bit of housekeeping. So we have scheduled some time at the end of the session for Q&A. So if you've got any questions, you can either submit those through the chat pane or through the Q&A panel, and we'll get to those at the end of the webinar. Also, the session is being recorded, so it'll be made available to everyone who's registered on demand, and you'll also be able to share that with anyone that couldn't make this particular time. So before we get on to Mike's specific insights on this topic, I wanted to take you through some of Cavell's research and some of the context behind the topic for today's session. I wanted to talk about next generation communications and primarily collaboration platforms and how important value added services are now becoming for any service provider who wants to succeed in enabling telephony within collaboration. Firstly, I think we have to look at why collaboration platforms have become so popular and why we've seen such demand over the past few years and why we continue to see such demand in the future. So let's look specifically at Microsoft Teams, which is the world's biggest collaboration platform. The numbers on screen are Microsoft's published active user numbers for Microsoft Teams, and then our Cavell forecast for future growth. So as you can see, massive spike in adoption around the time of the pandemic. Mike and I were talking about this as we were planning the session. Obviously, there was huge demand for solutions that could cater for remote and home working, and Teams was optimally placed to meet that requirement. During 2021, Microsoft changed the way they reported these numbers. They changed from daily active users to monthly active users, and that aligned them with how they report on Microsoft 365 subscriptions. And the last public announcement we got in terms of user numbers was that there were 320 million monthly active Microsoft Teams users. And our Cavell data forecasts do show that the growth will slow in terms of adoption of Microsoft Teams, but still by the end of the year, we think there'll be probably more than 350 million monthly active users on Microsoft Teams, which, as I said, it makes it by far the world's leading collaboration platform, and it's pretty remarkable uptake and growth so far. So, as most of you on the call, I'm sure know, Teams does not include PSTN telephony capability as standard. You have to add that to Microsoft. And I wanted to look at the opportunity for Teams telephony in the market on a sort of global scale. So for those of you who know Cavell, we're a research firm that's worked in communications for more than 15 years. And we are tracking more than 467 million business telephony users around the world. And that's using premises-based business telephony systems, mobile-based business systems, and cloud-based systems. And we think that nearly half of that market is addressable for Microsoft Teams voice solutions. So a really significant amount of users that Teams could address with its telephony options. We think that nearly 100 million users would be suitable for direct routing or operator connect, the fixed line telephony enablement option in Teams. But we actually see an even bigger opportunity for a mobile solution like Teams Phone Mobile, if you look at the rest of the world, where in a lot of regions, there's a much higher propensity to use mobile solutions. So if you look at markets such as Africa and Latin America, and what this shows is that there's a massive total addressable market for Teams voice providers to target. And that's why we've seen so many service providers and communications providers quickly look to add Teams Direct routing practices, become part of the Operator Connect program, so that they can access this growing market for Microsoft Teams telephony. However, it's not just Teams, and I wanted to look at the other collaboration leaders in the space. So on screen is our Cavell forecasts for telephony-enabled users in Microsoft Teams, Cisco WebEx, calling, and also Zoom Phone. And over the next 5 years, we think that these three leading collaboration platforms might cover nearly 100 million users globally. So it just shows this is a huge addressable market. And the impressive growth of telephony enablement within collaboration platforms has seen service providers across the world rush to create voice practices around, as I said, not just Microsoft, but across Zoom and Cisco WebEx calling as well. What we wanted to talk about today was some of the potential challenges, because to access this market and to become a telephony partner within these platforms doesn't come without its challenges. The most common challenges we hear about at Cavell are related to commercials and go-to-market strategy. And I'll dive into those in a bit more detail now. One key consideration facing communication providers globally is the increasingly challenging nature of the commercial environment. Cavell has been noting a reduction in both margin and revenue streams relating to cloud communications, UCaaS, or collaboration telephony for a number of years. And this has been acknowledged by our service providers. The graph on the right is from one of our service provider surveys, where more than 40% of respondents said that they'd seen a reduction in average revenue per user over the past few years. Reductions have been seen across traditional areas, calling minutes, terminations, and DDI provision. And the pressure on these historically key areas is being felt by providers across developed communication markets. So primarily if you look at North America and Western Europe. The actual level of margin and revenue reduction does vary by provider, depending on the exact product set, the infrastructure, the back-end resources, and also their market focuses across regions or vertical markets. But it's something that we're seeing in the market as really significant. And there are multiple factors which providers have cited as key drivers behind this trend. Increasingly competitive markets as these become more developed across collaboration and telephony and UCaaS. And the key thing that I've highlighted on the left here, this transition away from a self-developed or self-managed UC platforms such as Broadworks to third-party platforms with underlying subscription costs, or to telephony enablement within a platform such as Microsoft Teams or Cisco WebEx calling or Zoom. And this increasing utilization of collaboration services, which provide many of the features of a UC system at a reduced commercial cost, have impacted this. So many of the communication providers that we talk to now are re-examining their commercial models to try and drive efficiency elsewhere, whilst exploring potential portfolio expansion areas to augment some of those losses from those traditional telephony streams. The other thing I wanted to talk about was differentiation, and this is something that we hear a lot about at Cavell. The graph on the left is from our latest service provider research, and it shows that the number one way service providers traditionally differentiate is via product features. But what do you do if you can't differentiate on features because you and your competitors are all selling Microsoft Teams and the front end is Microsoft Teams or WebEx calling or Zoom? You have to look outside of product features as a way to differentiate and try and stand out. And these might be, I've highlighted a few of the most common ones that we see on the right. They might be your customer service provision. They might be your geographic coverage. We've seen focus on the automation capabilities in platform like Operator Connect. They might be how you price your offerings in terms of commercials, but that can lead to a race to the bottom and this commoditization of telephony services. But the one key area that we wanted to focus on today is through value-added services, and I know that's what Mike is going to talk about shortly. As I mentioned, lots of service providers are experiencing these commercial challenges and are reducing average revenue per user and average margin per user in the new collaboration telephony world, and they need to look at areas to augment those revenue and margin streams. And with that in mind, this again is from another of our service provider surveys. Every year we survey hundreds of service providers across North America and Western Europe and increasingly the wider world. And we ask service providers what are their biggest revenue drivers now and what they think they'll be in the future. And so as you can see on the graph, 40% of the service providers that we surveyed said that they currently drive most revenue through telephony enablement services. So those traditional areas that we were talking about before, termination, minutes, DDIs. But many service providers expect this revenue to continue to fall in the future. And only around 17% of providers think that telephony will be their biggest area in the future, around 21% of providers. So a really significant fall there. If we look at value-added services, only 17% of providers think that value-added services represent their biggest revenue driver now in 2024. But that increases to a massive 46% of providers who think that value-added services will be their biggest revenue driver in the future. And that's why we wanted to talk about the topic in the session today. We get so much feedback and we do a lot of research and also work in the consulting space and commercial and technical due diligence. And so many communication service providers are having to re-augment their portfolios to try and supplement those dwindling margin and revenue streams. And value-added services, both from our perspective and the perspective of service providers within the industry, potentially provide the best option for revenue and margin generation. So more than enough from me here, but I just wanted to sort of highlight the key takeaways from my portion of the presentation and the Cavell research. First of all, I don't think service providers can ignore collaboration platforms. And the reason for that is because of overwhelming demand from enterprises, which we've seen is going to continue to grow in platforms like Microsoft Teams. But not just the future demand, the potential size of the existing market. If we're talking about 320 plus million Microsoft Teams users, more than 20 million of those have already enabled telephony services. That's a really sizable addressable market for service providers to address, and they can't ignore that size of the market. But despite that really sizable addressable market, you really shouldn't ignore the fact that there are margin and revenue challenges, and enabling telephony within these platforms creates a new set of commercial challenges around margin and revenue generation. As I said, the license revenue that you make on a Microsoft Teams seat, if you even resell the license at all, it is not going to be comparable than what you would have made previously on a Broadworks license. And finally, our research shows that one of the best options to supplement revenue and margin streams will be value-added services. And Mike will take us through what some of those value-added services look like in a minute. But service providers, it's not just Cavell, service providers themselves, and the data that we had back from our surveys show that service providers think that value-added services will be the biggest revenue generator in the future for their businesses. As I said, that is more than enough from me on the Cavell side, and I wanted to hand over to Mike, who helps service providers globally with their value-added services portfolio. So, Mike, over to you.
Okay, thanks, Patrick. So I'm going to spend the next sort of 15 minutes or so talking through some of our experiences at Akixi working with the service provider community around value-added services. So to begin with, I'll just talk briefly about Akixi for those of you who don't know about us. So we've been in the market for over 10 years. We have focused to date mainly around the Cisco base, where Cisco Broadworks capability was used as a substitute product for the PBX market. And what you found with that BroadSoft-based solution was that inherently it required an ecosystem around it to provide a complete substitute function to a PBX. And one of those areas was around call analytics, which was where Akixi played. Last year, we bought a business called Mondigo, which provides CRM integration. Again, another capability which you need to replace PBXs in market. And that sort of 300 million plus market, which is out there based upon, on-prem systems, all requires substituting over time. And, a lot of these major cloud platforms, although they do the basics very well, they need a wrapper of other capabilities around them to provide a complete substitution function as part of the overall solution for that end customer. So we've been very successful with that. We've grown to north of 20 million turnover business, profitable. We work with over 100 service providers worldwide in all major markets. We have about 1 million end users on our solutions today. Typically, our end customer is probably around 27 seats, which means that their overall UCaaS size is probably north of 70. Some of our larger customers are well into 4 figures in terms of user seats that they're using. So what we'll do now is sort of cut to the chase and get into some of the background to this. And I thought I'd start. I used a sort of generic slide, which Patrick touched upon, which was the movement from sort of home-built UCaaS systems into supplying PSTN or calling connectivity into the major cloud platforms like Zoom, Cisco, Teams, etc. And you see the associated revenue drop with that. So I was talking to a service provider this week. They've got north of 450,000 seats on Teams today. And we were talking about some of the issues they face. And one of the obvious ones is the drop in revenues from selling a hosted PBX solution, which is sort of built on Broadworks or any other homebrew type solution through to just reselling PSTN connectivity. And one of the things they mentioned, which just beyond the commercials, is the channel resistance that comes with that. So trying to convince your channel to keep on bashing away and selling a low-end UCaaS offer against the Teams market is a fairly futile thing. So do you go out there and keep on trying to sell something which admittedly has high margins, but your win rate is probably sub 10%, or do you go out there and then try and basically get on the wagon with Teams and sell it? And the channels are looking at it and going, okay, well, we want to make a lot more money out of this, and applying value-added services is one of the ways of achieving that. And that's what's really starting to drive the market now, alongside the price attrition, which Patrick mentioned a bit earlier. So when you're getting sort of 20, 30 points of price attrition in the market over a sort of 24, 36 month period, that tends to focus you around how you can start to generate additional revenues going forward. For those of us who've been in the market for a bit of a time, it's akin to what happened in SIP trunking probably 6 or 7 years ago. You've got a lot of entrants come in, that forces the price down, so everybody's got to look at ways and means of developing additional revenues associated with it. So that's what we're going to take a look at and see what's been applied out there and what's working. So we've probably had about 50 or so engagements with service providers which are in flight at this present moment in time around value-added services. We've probably got about 15 plus who are going into market at the moment around Teams specifically. And you tend to see a journey which is in a sort of 3-phased approach. So typically a service provider needs to get the foundational components in market first and foremost, right? So initially that was around direct routing, But these days, Microsoft also encourages the implementation of Operator Connect as well, which is a sort of more standardized version of direct routing, if you will. Associated with that, you then have the ability to control and manage it. Because if you sort of leave it to sort of PowerShell, that can be a fairly tedious thing to do. So you implement some form of portal. So that gives you the sort of foundational capability. And then we see service providers, look at the market, and this tends to be market specific. So obviously Teams is more penetrated in some markets rather than others, and you probably have a discussion on that later as to which are the most exposed markets. From memory, US and UK markets are the two best markets for Teams worldwide, and that's where you start to see the outcrop of value-added services. So working through, well, what's the business rationale for them? Because what you don't want to do is spend a truckload of money on value-added services and then end up with like a 2% penetration of the base associated with that. So it comes down to, what's the ARPU you're generating out of that value-added service? And then secondly, what sort of penetration rate you've got? And then thirdly, you need to look at the cost implementation associated with it. So can you have a platform which can apply a range of value-added services over a common set of cloud capabilities? So can your value-added services run on Cisco? Can they run on Zoom? Can they run on Teams? And can they run from a single platform so you lower the operational costs associated with it? So that's the second phase. And then you get into, okay, so I'm going to do this. So what services am I going to apply in my value-added service bundle? And there's a variety of different options which we'll take a look at as we go through.
Mike, just on that, can you talk to us about how long the process takes in terms of the timeline from sort of stage 1 to stage 3? And I get that it'll vary for different service providers, but if you could just talk a bit about the timeline.
Yeah, so I think from what I've seen, most operators take they used to take between sort of 6 and 12 months to do the foundational pieces. With the advent of the accelerator partners in the Operator Connect domain, that has accelerated considerably. Okay, so you can probably get it done in let's say maybe 1 to 2 months, something like that. Applying the value-added services components, that very much depends on the portfolio that you want to implement. Yeah. So, some are a lot easier than others, and I guess we'll kind of come on to that. But if you take our analytics, for example, we can attach up and deliver a service associated with analytics in literally a matter of days. But if, for sake of argument, you wanted to attach in a relatively complex contact center into it, that's a different game altogether and can take many, many months. But I think what we see is service providers working through, do they stick with direct routing, or do they implement Operator Connect, or do they go faster and go for the value-added services components? So those, we're seeing quite a lot of variance in terms of approaches there. But I think, inevitably you're going to have to do most of it if you want to remain competitive in market over the longer term. Okay, so in terms of the business rationale associated with it, no marketing presentation is complete without a graph which goes up and to the right. But what we've got here is one of the business cases which we worked for an operator in the US market, and this is a sort of compare contrast of the revenue associated with or without value-added services. And so I think we modeled up to, I think it was 5 years, 400,000 seats over that time period, which for the US is not uncommon. And what we found was in this model, where I think we had it was just 2 value-added services we applied to direct routing, if memory serves me right. So the ARPU on analytics was like $3 to $4. So, it was a sort of middle of the road type ARPU. And then CRM integration was sitting at around 7. So if you model that out, we got a value-added service boost up to about 60% in terms of revenues over 5 years, which if you basically looked at that in its totality, came out at around 22 million of additional revenues. But one of the things that it does impact quite significantly is things like churn. It makes the thing a lot stickier. I know these are sort of cliches we use in the industry, but it does actually make a big difference. Okay, because what you find is that the end customers rely upon some of these capabilities quite a lot, and as a result of that, it becomes incredibly sticky. I'll give you an example. In some of our customers in the UK, they've seen in a transition from a Cisco to Teams environment, they've actually waited for our analytics to appear on Teams because it does some very specific things which are welded into their operational processes. And so they were able to effectively delay a customer for about 6 to 12 months in their Teams migration, so they had that flexibility to map the analytics and keep the same operational processes.
Just on you mentioned the stickiness and customer retention. Those are sort of intangibles that don't directly relate to the growth. So there's other intangibles as well, aren't there, in terms of additional areas where this is benefiting outside of the sort of hard numbers?
Yeah, I think you'll start to see, obviously, on the churn side of things, there'll be components which can boost this quite a lot, and also you get secondary service issues. I've seen situations where you can see complete customer defection. Okay, so say for sake of argument, you cannot support a certain level of componentry of value-added service around Teams, but your competitor can. So they take the voice business off you. Yeah. And as a result of that, you lose the SD-WAN that went with it. Okay, so I've seen in a number of service providers some fairly catastrophic situations in large customers in particular, where they've got linkage between these services, and as a result of that, they've seen the need to get these services in market fast just to offset the potential churn associated with a larger customer, where you have both the connectivity services, but also the management services that go with it.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. So let's get down to the meat of this. So in terms of the sort of overlay services that you could look at adding in, obviously you come from Akixi, so we're going to push our stuff at the top. So calling analytics, and this isn't just me saying this. Like, I've had conversations with some very successful Teams voice practices, and they're sort of feeding back, we need calling analytics. It's the number one thing that we're being asked for in association with our Teams practice. So there's a lot of demand out there. And also, one of the things that we do in particular is that we can do true real time. And what I mean by that is sub 1 second, not sub 5, sub 10, or whatever else people tend to define as real time. And that basically opens up a much broader use case spectrum for calling analytics. Secondly, CRM integration. What you find with these things is that if you want to migrate, I don't know, an Avaya system, a Mitel system onto Teams, you need to tick all of these boxes. And so having them in portfolio does two things. One, it completes RFPs, and number two, obviously allows you to deliver the functionality. So there's that sort of secondary intangible, which provides that capability. Like contact centers becoming more and more important. I've had conversations probably with 20 service providers in the last 3 months who are also looking at like contact center capability. Call recording transcription, very common. Full contact center tends to be higher up the segment spectrum and typically more white glove. Something that's popping up now is handset as a service. So adding in handsets as part of the service bundle that goes out there. And then things such as ease of user management as well. Sometimes that's bundled into the service, sometimes it's not. Now, the thorny issue of attach rates then comes up, right? So, what's a good attach rate for some of these things? So typically in our experience, calling analytics sits in the sort of 10 to 20 point mark. We do have some customers who are much more successful in this area, can get it up to sort of 70, 80 points. But, realistically, that's where you're going to be sitting. CRM, roughly the same sort of thing. Like contact center, a little bit lower. But on the flip side, like contact center will plug you into a different customer cohort that generally tend to be larger. So they're going to be in the sort of 150 plus seat domain. Call recording, very much focused around specific verticals. Full contact center tends to be, as I said, larger use cases, 500 plus, where that contact center will be likely split out. So it's going to be something like the connect model through Teams rather than the extend model, which will be linking back into the light contact center. Handset as a service, relatively new. I'll put 20 points plus. We'll have to see about that one. And then user management, you pretty much need that across the board. To whether it's self-management, I mean, Operator Connect does some of this, but there's still a lot of capability that needs to be added in.
Yeah, I think even in Operator Connect, there's still a real demand for that user management piece. And you also, when we were planning, you did talk about some sort of newer value-added services as well that providers might be considered, bots, that sort of area.
Yeah. Here's a slide I prepared earlier, as they say. So this is a couple of things that we're sort of looking at the moment, sort of virtual agent capability. Sort of you wrap that around either an existing contact center. So say for sake of argument, the customer has got a legacy contact center. They've got some degree of integration with Teams. Maybe they've used Call to Teams or similar sorts of things, and they want to upgrade the capability of that contact center. So they start attaching virtual agents into it to basically lower the amount of demand on the existing human agents that sit in there. The other one which we've seen recently is enhanced queues. I mean, Microsoft announced the Queues app with some additional callback capability associated with it. One of the use cases we're starting to see now is sort of plugging gaps where functionality is linked to premium license models within M365. So for example, something like the Queues app where you need Teams Premium. So maybe you want a Queues app without Teams Premium. So are there ways and means of achieving that? Again, that could be broken out as a separate value-added service. And it's something that, we're talking to a number of service providers about at the present moment in time. Just to give an example of how that could play out, this is in the UK. So in the UK, the NHS, National Health Service, they have defined a standardized way of delivering telephony into primary healthcare. So that's GP practices to you and me. That's called the Digital Care Services Cloud Telephony Framework, which is actually version 2. Previously, the word cloud wasn't in there, so you could get away with doing a digital PBX. Now the NHS is stouting that it's cloud only. And one of the things that they're trying to do is improve access to services for primary care. So, if you dial into a primary care practice on a prepaid mobile, you don't want to be hanging on to a voice queue for an hour, okay, trying to get hold of a service. So things such as detailed reporting on the queues, the ability to call back, having those sorts of capabilities, simple bolt-on is something which is required in market. And you see some of the capabilities that, the NHS has actually flagged, which is actually part of what Akixi does today. So that's actually one of our wallboards, which sits within some of the NHS documentation. So fairly straightforward to implement, but adding it in as a value-added services completes the solution offer for the service provider and opens up what is quite a large market, because in healthcare you get primary healthcare, but then you've got secondary services like pharmacists and opticians that sit around the same type of model. So I think that's where we're going to end my bit, and I think we're going to do a bit of Q&A. Was that right?
Yeah, bang on time for some Q&A, and I can see we've had a couple of questions in the chat. I think you've covered a couple of these sort of in your, especially on the value-added services bit, but we'll cover them anyway. Which value-added service is quickest and easiest to add to a team's direct routing solution? So you talked about the management. Would that be the sort of key area?
I think management is not necessarily, well, if you get it from one of the accelerator partners, then yeah. If you got to do it yourself, probably takes quite a bit longer. But that's a kind of means to an end, moving users around, changing numbers, all the usual moves, adds and changes stuff. I think the one I would say is second quickest to deploy is probably the analytics piece. And I'm kind of blowing our own trumpet a bit here, but we built a lot of capability around the provisioning to make that as simple and as fast as possible. Okay. What's also happening out there is that the acceleration partners, some of them have got quite sophisticated portals, and they're starting to build marketplaces as well to facilitate some of this. It's still in the relatively early stages, and I suspect it's going to take a little bit more time to work itself through. But certainly on the analytics side, we've got customers up and running in. If they wanted to do, say, a POC on their service, literally we can get that done in a couple of days, and they're off and running it on either test tenants or sample customers.
Right. And just even from the Cavell research, we asked customers in our Microsoft Teams Enterprise survey, if you buy Teams telephony, so your direct routing on your Operator Connect, what other solutions would you be interested in buying? And their top answer was call analytics, in terms of the highest proportion of businesses would want to buy call analytics alongside direct routing or Operator Connect. So the research sort of tallies there as well. There's another question here, and I would assume that there's a yes to this, but if you could explain, does the amount of training for sales and support staff vary depending on the value-added solution, and which involves most? I was thinking contact center initially might be one that requires a bit of work.
Yeah, I think, obviously something which is quite white glove is a specialist sale. What we tend to see on some of the, and in some respects, call recording can be just because you need to understand the vertical specific use cases associated with it. So if it's sitting in finance or similar, then MiFID 2 is probably driving that. Do you understand MiFID 2 well? Right, all of that good stuff. So that's quite a specialist area. What you find on the more general areas, so like call analytics, for example, there's sort of two categories, right? So you get the customer that says, okay, I've got detailed call analytics on my current solution. I need it on Teams. And then you go, okay, we can tick that box. So off you go. It's almost like a distressed purchase, if you will. Okay. Then you've got the customers who don't quite know why they need it, but they probably do need it, and that needs a bit more of a specialist sale associated with it. And that's where we tend to focus our resources. So we put quite a lot of effort in terms of go-to-market support with the service provider customers that we have to help them go out and sell in those particular domains.
And there's good questions come in here. What's driving confidence that value-added services will drive revenue in the future, and why not now? And referring back to the Cavell data that we put on slide 10, that service providers think it's going to be the biggest revenue driver in the future. I think it's partly maturity of the market. And Mike mentioned what happened in the SIP market several years ago. Effectively, the move towards telephony enablement in platforms like Teams or Zoom or Cisco is still relatively new. Operator Connect's only been in the market, a couple of years, direct routing 4 years or so. So they're still relatively immature solutions in the market. So I think providers developing their value-added services portfolio around that is still sort of at the beginning. Mike, would you agree with that in terms of what might be affecting sort of confidence in driving confidence in the future?
I think the one thing I would point to is that, you know, we've seen a value-added service market build up around the Cisco base and be pretty darn successful, right? In terms of, you know, we've got, you know, service providers who've got 10, 20 million line of business VAS solutions out there today. Okay. And what they're doing at the moment is looking at effectively migrating some of that over onto Teams as the underlying call control platform changes. But then in terms of new business, you know, the use cases don't change that much. That's the thing. So like if you're going to replace a Mitel or a Avaya PBX as part of a collab migration to Teams, you're going to have to fulfill those specific requirements. So if you don't have the value-added use case, or if you don't have the value-added service, you can't address the use case. So therefore, you're out of the deal. So that's why we're pretty confident that you're going to need this going forward. And yeah, I think what's happening at the moment is that sometimes, you know, people just delay their decision on Teams because they don't have all the necessary componentry. A bit like the example I stated earlier with when it was coming from a Cisco base over to Teams, they delayed for sort of 6 to 12 months to get the analytics they needed.
Yeah. Another question in here are there particular vertical markets where one particular value-added services is table stakes, i.e., call recording in finance?
Yeah. So yeah, I think table stakes is quite a strong word, but I think you do get specific vertical use cases where you need certain value-added capability. So, you know, just from the Akixi side, we see things such as retail, distributed retail, where they want to track performance of retail stores and make sure that they're delivering against certain metrics, lost basket value if they're actually selling to consumers, etc. That generally tends to have quite a strong driver. In healthcare, there's a lot of compliance. Okay. And ironically, now we're starting to see in veterinary practices, as in the UK, a lot of private equity has hoovered up vets practices. So again, they're trying to create the same commonality. You can think of vets practices in some respects as another type of distributed retail, right? Because they're just selling a service rather than a hard product. Again, you see the same sorts of requirements around analytics in that area.
Got it. I think that's all the questions that we've got in for now. I suppose, just lastly, Mike, if any of the viewers want to know where to find out more about Akixi and what it is you're doing and understand more about the value-added services, what's the best thing for them to do? Okay,
so I think we put a few contact points in the next slide, but you know, from my standpoint, I think, you know, feel free to reach out to myself or the team at Akixi. And we can help you around some of the planning process associated with value-added services. You'll probably receive an email with a link to a sort of mini business case, so you can sort of slot in some numbers and see what it looks like from your perspective. We've helped a lot of service providers do proof of concepts, so you know, spin up a capability. See what it looks like in terms of the value-added capabilities and what the service structure could look like. So we've got a whole host of those in market at the moment. And finally, should you decide to take those into market and productize fully, we can help you through the launch process. That's a bit further down the line. I think in the short term, come and talk to us around some of these areas, and we can help you in a number of those, and then probably help you around the ecosystem as well.
Great. And as you said, there are some contact details on here for Akixi, and also everyone who's been on the webinar today. We would love your feedback about today's webinar and the topic. So please, you can scan the QR code on screen, and that'll take you a link to submit feedback on the presentation itself. While you are doing that, and I never leave these QR codes up long enough to be scanned, I just wanted to say a massive thanks to both Akixi and to Mike for joining us today. And additionally, if anyone's interested in any of the Cavell research on this, more details on plans or the service provider research, please do get in touch or head to cavellgroup.com. Mike, just thank you so much for coming on the webinar. Really appreciate your time.
Okay, thanks, Patrick.
And that's it. Thank you, everyone, for joining us, and we'll see you again soon in the next Cavell webinar.